Thank you very much, Michael and Kutan, for this. I am quite a fan of your work. I've been following your practice for a while now. So it's quite a pleasure for me to be able to have you guys. This is first or the second event of the Master in Architecture in Project Research from the University of Buenos Aires. And we are having quite a lineup these 2 months. We just presented 2 books from the master program, and we are having Peter Eisenman in April. And today we just confirmed with Reiseru Memoto, so we're thrilled to have quite an international setup of lectures. So you guys are opening our series this year, and it's amazing. So thank you very much for taking your time and doing this. And thank you the audience for joining us. First of all, I want to tell everyone that you can make questions whenever you like. You have the Q&A button in the bottom of the screen, so you can ask whatever you want anytime. We're going to answer all those questions by the end of the conversation. I hope it will be short but intense. So I'm going to start presenting Michael and Kutan. The work of Michael Young and Kutan Ayata is absolutely consistent. I believe that their practice produces drawings, objects, and buildings as derivations from one another. It's quite difficult to differentiate between the 2D and the 3D designs. And in some way, it is so hard to identify scales among objects and buildings. I dare you to define where a Young Ayata project ends and the other one starts. The consistency, it's very hard to achieve, especially within a practice so experimental and defiant of convention. I believe that this is achieved due to a master approach to the problem of representation. Each project explores a different way of understanding architecture from theory to technique. And it is exactly this issue of representation why I personally believe Young Ayata is one of the most exciting and mesmerizing practices of architecture today, because they are not giving up the power of architecture to communicate in both traditional and radically experimental ways. Young Ayata are the recipients of the 2016 Design Vanguard Award from the Architectural Record. The apartment building DL 1310, designed in collaboration with Michan Architecture, received the 2019 Progressive Architecture Award from Architect magazine. In 2015, they were one of 2 first prize winners in the international competition for the new Bauhaus Museum in Dessau, Germany. They were finalists in the 2015 MoMA YAP program in Istanbul, Turkey. In 2014, the partners were the recipients of the Young Architects Prize from the Architectural League of New York, and their entry in the Open International Competition for the Daejeon Citizen Gymnasium in South Korea received the honorable mention. A manifesto titled Estranged Object, Realism in Art and Architecture, written by Michael Young with the projects of Young and Ayata, was published in the spring of 2015 by the Graham Foundation. Recently, the firm's work was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art with the Istanbul Modern, the Graham Foundation, Yale University, SCI-Arc, and Princeton University. I'm very honored to present you Michael Young and Kutan Ayata. Thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I would like to start. Well, the conversation is entitled Drawings, Objects, and Buildings. So I'll start with the drawings. By looking at your drawings, you can clearly identify a tradition that involves digital technology, from the Mirage's lines published in the wonderful article Digital Remediation in 2013. there is an interest in problematizing the scope of the geometries of the digital world, but there is also mirages whose intuitive strokes seem to have little to do with the infinitesimal precision of splines. So I was wondering if mirages is like an anti-digital tradition that interests you, or why are you particularly looking at mirages drawings?
Well, yeah, it's a good place to start. We can start with the archery range from Marius and Pinos. Well, look, first of all, both Kutan and I are fans of their architecture, and not only fans of their architecture as it was built in different phases, but fans especially of Marius was an incredible draftsman, and the drawings that he and with Carmen Pinos and Benedetta Tagliabue were able to make are some of the great sort of masterpieces of draftsmanship over the end of the 20th century, start of the 21st century. If to speak just particularly to this one and the series of drawings that you're looking at, there's a number of traces in Marius's work of using compasses to notate complex curvatures, building it out of compound relationships of rotations, centers, arcs, the ways in which a compass begins to describe curvature. And with any compass describing curvature, you begin to build up a relationship of geometry that works off tangents and normals. And so for us, this kind of experiment, these kinds of drawings were kind of two things, double reasons. One, trying to understand a little bit more of the ways in which somebody like Marius would use curvature, trying to understand that language. And in the archery range specifically, we found 3 different languages that transformed in and out of each other. But then at the same time, both Kutan and I were starting our teaching careers at the end of the first decade of the century. And so starting around 2006 or so, we were starting to teach these courses in advanced architectural representation at Columbia. And one of the situations we were asking ourselves was, how do we teach drawing with digital modeling tools? And what are the things, what are the legacies within different histories of drawing that we feel are resonant, that would carry through and carry forward? And what else is going on with it? So at a certain level, these are all about the ways in which a software like Rhino, a non-uniform basis spline modeler, builds curvatures through the movements of tangents and normals. Those are the calculations, the calculus that's operating within the curves. It's just typically that computation is turned off, and what's turned on is the curve. So at the most blunt level is, what happens if you turn the curve off and turn the tangents and normals on, so that you're now getting a graphic registration of the movement of curvature based on that geometry. But as important to us as the geometric description was that we were beginning to work with in this manner, is that once you worked with thousands upon thousands of tangents and normals, you no longer could think of these in typical terms as drawings, meaning lines that denote edges of figures, but you had to start thinking about them in something that's closer to painting, meaning mixtures of colors, various intensities of saturation and hue and luminosity, and depth that's produced through density and the loosening of density. Painterly questions as opposed to linear questions, questions about sensation into and around the field, not bounding and binding figures on top of a field. So I don't know, maybe I'll stop there. Is that enough like to start some bit of interest in the drawing techniques?
Maybe just to dovetail to that, Michael, in hindsight, and this is not necessarily the terms we ever discussed this together, but in some manner there is kind of the problem of the precedent here that one works through as an architect, as a designer, as a student, where the precedent through formal analysis kind of maintains a degree of control over the next steps of what you do with it. I think in some way, these kind of set up potentials of other worlds through the president. Maybe the president lives as a ghost, but what becomes of it and what the president was, they're not in any kind of binary relationship. A new kind of aesthetic has emerged, a new kind of potential has emerged out of that operation. I think these set of, let's say, images we're looking at that we initially called drawings, began to explore, the very aesthetics and effects that Michael just talked about in terms of their painterly qualities. And maybe in some way, our current preoccupation with the conventions of plans also point to that direction in terms of, how we view the precedent. I find that kind of interesting. It lives on as a ghost, but not something that, we hold on a pedestal to live by, but we kind of engage it in a particular way to open up another world.
It's nice how you work with what Mirages did, and like you operate with the material and not with like the context of the material. So you're kind of generating these images that, well, Michael mentioned something about like density or like abundance of lines that produce some kind of moire effect that generates like layers. That maybe this is what Kutan refers to ghosts of these images. Like you can see many images in one. So in a sense, you're like through abstraction and through a very precise technique, generating some kind of ornamental representation of something that is quite abstract. And some images may appear like some maybe some figural images. So I was thinking about, what do you think about that transformation in these drawings from something that is completely abstract into something like that is quite ornamental and maybe related to some kind of figurative apparition, maybe you can say?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a couple questions in there that tie into a number of themes that work through projects, throughout the past 12 years. Young Ayata started about 12 years ago. And one is just, one, it should be said that at a certain level, we're interested in abstraction, but we're not interested in abstraction as something that is understood as against or the opposite of a question such as realism. We're interested in the ways in which abstraction actually performs as an aspect of estrangement of the real that allows you to think about and or consider or view or understand our relationships to reality as constructed, as built on assumptions. And that's a very loose set of terms and set of things. And if we really want to crack them open and get into them, we should, because we just spend quite a bit of time talking about them, and they can be taken in the wrong way. We've noticed quite often that when we say a word like realism, people immediately think of, let's say, realistic, photorealistic renderings for kind of commercial consumption. And that's not what we mean. We mean it within a legacy that goes all the way back to things like Gustave Courbet and Flaubert and Zola and Tolstoy, traditions out of the 19th century where the everyday description of the world begins to become strange. You begin to have another relationship with it. And in that estrangement, in that way in which the everyday begins to become abstract, it notice reality in a different manner. So now that's a very kind of like weird conversation when we're looking at these funny drawings of millions of lines just getting dense and intense and vibrating and fluctuating. But here's part of how it ties in. Part of it is an estrangement of your tools that you work with. And I think every kind of artist and architect goes through these sort of moments where you're trying to understand what it is that is your media, your medium, the ways in which you produce the representations that you work on. And if you can challenge yourself to see them and use them and produce new things with them, that in and of itself becomes kind of the start of another project. So you asked a question about figuration, I think, Santiago, and how figuration comes in and out of atmospheres. So if one is to build figure not by the bounding contour that delimits it as different from the ground that it sits on, but instead, if one is to build figuration up through the layering of thousands and thousands of colored marks, which is what painting does. Painting builds figuration out of its ground, out of its matrix, as opposed to demarcating a figure on a ground like drawing does. The ways in which one would create a figure in this technique we're talking about right now, we start using things like symmetry. We start using things like off symmetry, start using things where it's just almost symmetrical or symmetrically isolated in local patches, or the symmetry begins to create the appearance of a kind of funnel or a void or a depth or a movement into the page out of the atmosphere, as opposed to the bounding of a figuration as determined by a contour. And this is again just an extension of us trying to figure out how to teach, explore, experiment, and at a certain level abuse our mediums and our tools. So the question of ornament is ornament and decoration, we could say, because we're interested in both and probably interested in both equally. And maybe a brief definition, just to lay it out on the table, because it might lead into some of the objects that we produced, is that we have a tendency to treat ornament as something that desires attention, as something that an architect or an artist produces for you to look at with some degree of desired intent. It's usually integral at some level to a structure, to a material, to a detail, to a piece of construction, a form. Whereas decoration tends to move all over. It tends to hide seams, confuse materiality, produce sort of atmospheric affects, challenge decorum as opposed to content to be signified. And so decoration tends to move in an all over, more atmospheric attitude. And so we are often as interested in decoration as we are in ornament. And maybe to say it in a more precise term, we're interested in the moments in which decoration becomes ornament or ornament becomes decoration. And so these things we're looking at, they have moments where they're trying to guide attention and other moments where they're trying to distract or diffuse attention, to kind of smudge it out into an overall attitude, a tone, a kind of all over movement across the surface. This will become maybe a little bit more specific if we look at some of the objects we made and some of the architecture as well. But as far as how they kind of relate to the drawings, those early drawings are the kind of seeds of things that will become explored with a little bit more specificity later on in some work.
And maybe just to kind of build on that, maybe the tension between abstraction and realism we're talking about. Like one could argue about these, drawings, images we're looking at as literal descriptions of embedded geometry. Like if you wanted to kind of represent actual geometry that's computed by our machines, that's how it would look. Like that's literally taking that information and presenting it. Yet we're seeing it through 72 resolution as mediated through satellites, through our screens, creating extra interference, other noise, other set of effects, through another kind of layer of maybe digital mediation. So like in some way, I think like all these intermediate steps through which we mediate information in the digital format are ways in which one could begin to really understand what it means to draw, how it's presented, through what it's mediated, and how it can open up, alternate aesthetics. Because nobody is marking anything on a piece of paper, on a plane anymore. Like these are all flat drawings, they're all 2D, nothing here is a three-dimensional information. But this, I think, affords us ways of building kind of depth in manners that are other than imagining of what one might begin to, construct perspectives or engage, I don't know, conventional methods of how we inscribe and describe depth within 2D planes. So I think as we kind of move from these drawings to the objects, that translation takes on other potentials as well in terms of how this pseudo 2D, 3D kind of information becomes something other than a 2D plane, because it's information that doesn't necessarily belong to any plane. It belongs to a plane that we can operate with, and it doesn't belong to a medium vis-a-vis the paper. So I think the potentials of that are super interesting. We've been through a decade of, I don't know, countless drawing shows where everybody interrogated what is drawing. Like, is this drawing? Is it not drawing? What used to be drawing? Does drawing matter? These questions at some level are exhausted and feel like we're past the point of even debating, whether we can accept these things as drawings. We are all mediating digitally. I think the last year, kind of for what it's worth, puts a lot of pressure on questions of representation, because clearly everything we communicated as architects, either with the world, either with clients, with builders, with our students, or amongst ourselves, peer-to-peer, has relied on digital material. And to say we don't do that, that's not primary in what we do, is not really kind of engaging the moment that we live in, whether due to COVID or before or after.
Yeah, well, you mentioned what it means to draw, and that's nice, because I invite the audience to approach the screen and look at this drawing in detail, and you will see you will identify lines, but you will also identify dots. But if you look closely, those dots are like donuts, and then you have lines that look like lights. So and these like donuts also transform into lines because they're repeated. So being more specific and more concrete, I was wondering about the techniques that you use, which specific techniques do you use, and in order to achieve what, right? Because there are some drawings that look like very precise, and there are other drawings that looks like they are not so under control, you may say. So are there techniques that go one way or the other, and what makes you decide which one to use for each project?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. It's specific to projects, and we are looking at the work of over a decade here. So some of them have changed as times have changed, and technology has changed, and we have changed too. I will say this, with the tangents and the normals, meaning simply straight lines that hit a curve at a single point, or straight lines that are then perpendicular to that point, we initially were drawing those one by one until kind of Grasshopper came around. And then we were able to engage into variation with Grasshopper in manners that allowed us to have a much different, finer grain of control, and also different ways in which to begin to tune and mix colors and densities and intensities and the movements of the lines as mark makings, as opposed to lines as edge demarcators. Within that, there's a couple different phases that were experiments. One is we were super interested in the histories of etching and engraving, the ways in which you could get just the mark of a slice in one material to, when imprinted and reprinted, make that hatch do things like produce moires. And some of the first conversations about moires come from Abraham Boss talking about moire effects within etching and engraving as being really good for clouds. We like that. We like the fact that you could animate something visually and optically by having diffractions. You could control luminosity by having lines that got thinner and thicker. And so there was one experiment we did when we were running the contouring of a surface, contouring like shipbuilding, running a contouring of a surface through processing to then inscribe dots onto the lines that would change in scale, so that at the resolution that they'd be printed at, you wouldn't see dots, you would just see lines getting fatter and thinner, but there would be so many of them that you'd begin to see luminosity. And so there's lots of different things like that, actually, like effects, questions that are deep within representation about the ways in which we make marks, and we often make marks in technologies of media for reproduction that then create effects that are in excess of what the technology was attempting to reproduce, and how one begins to explore those kinds of desires, but explore them with completely different technologies. I mean, the things we're looking at now here with these images, these are low relief, bas relief renderings, rendered only by producing straight lines that were drawn by an individual, one by one by one. So when we say rendering, we don't mean rendering engine, we mean it's rendered to appear to the eyeballs or to our sensations. So this is an axonometric, but it's a 2D drawing, just with thousands of lines drawn to meet outlines. And then once they meet outlines, they're drawn at 45 degrees, again, one by one, by person. And that seems a little insane. There's a funny thing. A lot of these drawings that are automated, huge swaths of them are automated. Huge swaths of them are just brute force made by people, by us, by Kutan and myself, and people who've worked with us over the years. And it's all in the service of trying to understand a certain effect, a certain spatial idea, a certain organizational idea, a certain architectural question, a certain relationship to representations, to media, to aesthetics. All of those things are kind of wrapped in there. And so whereas, I guess this is your question on technique, we're as interested in knowing our technique, but never as proof and/or as rationalization for the quality of what we're trying to achieve. The technique is simply there as means to explore an idea and try to see what else we can do with it.
Well, if you like, I can move on to the objects. I particularly want to talk about variation and the tradition in your work, relating variation. During the 1990s, there was a kind of explosion of architects and architecture that was interested in variation of a kind of generic object. So, and your work also many times operates in that way. I was looking for one particular object that varies his generic. Well, this is one of them, but there's one that is this one, base flowers. What is the role that you give to variation in your objects? Like, why do you use variation, you may say? Because obviously it's not something related to optimization. It's something that relates to something else. So I don't want to guess. I just want to ask if you have some kind of idea of what variation do in your work, or maybe it's something that you're not interested in anymore, but maybe you can elaborate on that.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting to see all these images together. We rarely do this, I guess. And kind of looking back, I think it's been two phases of interest in different types of variation. And I think the early, I mean, it's kind of funny to call early work within a span of 12 years. But I think this has been kind of interesting for us because I think we're both individuals who are kind of uncomfortable under their skin with settling on, you know, what we do is fixed, but rather what we do evolves into different territories. But, you know, like looking at it, it also carries certain sensibility with it. You know, variation has been part of it. I think the early work demonstrates maybe more like, I don't know, like variation in the geometric sense that explores gradients and moire effects and pattern shifts, their atmospheric kind of residue in the way they shift and shimmer. And I think that's something we left behind to a great extent. And perhaps in the latest work, the kind of variation is maybe like the variation between two things, or the variation between three things, but always about coupling or putting things together where there are tensions between them. Maybe the things that vary are towards the effect of putting both of those things, or this number of things that are pushed against one another, to sit outside of their own definition, perhaps towards an effect of decontextualizing them, perhaps towards an effect of trying to redefine them as new in their collaboration, but less so about maybe the kind of variation that was in the early work in terms of the pattern work, where, you know, we go towards a non-figural field. So like that would be my kind of diagnosis looking at these work. Like the number of things that vary are much less, I mean, countable, you know, within the finger of an hand than, I don't know, hundreds, millions.
It's also, I mean, there are certain, you know, it's good from time to time to look back through the work and kind of view it in its relationship to its sort of projects earlier and projects later. A general theme, though, is relationship between continuity and discontinuity, or between the continuous and its discretization, which is a computational question. And at the earlier level, the drawings earlier, the earlier work that was there were those drawings that were using tangents and normals and color. It's quite literally working at the discretization of the calculus of curvature in a digital environment. There's some of the objects you showed which are in that tradition that a number of people were experimenting with in the 90s and the early 2000s, which were the variation of a cellular unit, the ways in which a discrete cellular unit, a panel, a piece of structure, a piece of geometry could vary within the continuity of a complex geometry. As we get into some of these situations here too, like in this flower vase, there's some of those questions which work through both the formal situation of 5 vessels being contained within a single sack of geometry. There's also a kind of ornamental embedded inscription into the surface that's a multi-material 3D print that's related to mapping curvatures through kind of an effect of ornamenting the surface. But if you go to maybe an image where we see one of the flowers, Sure, or maybe the next one, or the one of the other ones is earlier to talk to. There came a question to us. I don't know if it's maybe one where we see the big flowers in there, and this came through these projects. Yeah, this one's fine. Sure, that there's another discontinuity here, and it's a conceptual discontinuity in that the vases have so much effort has been put into the design of the vases that people come to approach the project as one of vases and of estrangement of the vase and what it does to the positioning of flowers. But we also made the flowers. We designed and 3D printed the flowers. We created them in terms of their colors, their textures, their organizations as something that's semi-geological, biological, technological. And people wouldn't notice them at first, because they're hiding with real flowers, but they're also real things in and of themselves. And so that disjunction that's a conceptual disjunction between what is the thing that you're looking at that's supposed to be attracting your attention versus the thing that you're looking at that's distracting your attention, and what is real and what is not real. And at a certain level, what are the levels of reality that you're looking at? And when do you draw lines between different manifestations of that? And how do you do so? And that discontinuity, that juncture, that seam, we became interested in. And that's very different in physical manifestation from tangents and normals and colors, but there's a conceptual link there about the ways in which one creates and manages seams within the construction of any entity, be it a drawing, a building, or an object.
I was about to ask you about the flowers. And it's amazing that some of them, I didn't realize that. I thought they were like strange flowers that you pick, but it's great to know that some of them are 3D printed, designed. And well, you kind of answered some of my questions about the effects that you're producing, that has a lot to do with estrangement, like the flowers, or maybe like this kind of detail in relation with the lamp, right? Like produces some kind of estrangement regarding scale and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe we can talk about a little bit about the buildings, because this, as I said in the introduction, these things like come around again. So I was interested in the disciplinary traditions that you work with. I am referring like to architectural elements. There's clearly an interest in your work to integrate and distort architectural elements, maybe related to this idea of variation and this relation between continuous and discrete elements. Like there is no one or another, like they're embedded in the work. So I was wondering to which authors do you relate the most, the historical authors or works, specific works that you may find some kind of affinity with?
Yeah, what do you think, Kutan? I mean, it's a good sort of conversation piece between the two of us, because there are a handful of architects that I think we share in common. Some as kind of equal admiration. There's others that we kind of split on. I think those splits sometimes are important within a partnership. And we spend a great deal of time talking about other architects and other architectures. But I think we should also say that we spend as much time also talking about photographers, about painters, about sculptors, about filmmakers. So in a certain way, the question I think for us would be to treat all of these different forms of mediations and their representations as kind of part and parcel of what influences what we do. But I don't know, we can start saying some names too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm maybe thinking, I almost feel like recently, maybe in the last 3-4 years, it's been more about photographers, like in the way how the world is documented, or maybe redocumented in a way that overcomes the limits of the convention of photography. And I think discipline of photography did that in an incredible way, almost from the get-go. Like the moment it was seen as kind of in the, I don't know, like the 19th century as the alternative to the painting, it immediately started other ways of reinventing itself towards genres within that deviated from trying to represent the real as an evidence. And I think that topic in some way maybe highlights all our interests in terms of architecture and questions of representation. And photography seems to be kind of the discipline that dealt with this question for the better part of the last 150 years, and still continues to reinvent itself as it shifts from analog to digital technologies. And it's kind of amazing to see within that that there is almost no friction. There is almost no, I mean, I'm sure there are, of course, internal debates, but seems like there is no fear of the new. There is definitely nostalgia within, like we have. But in some way, the evolution of, I think for us specifically, the Düsseldorf school and how it carried forward in terms of its understanding of how realism could operate within photography as a fictional device. It's something we talk about a lot. I think there are a set of photographers and image makers, from Behers to Dement, to all the way to Philippe Dujardin and Philippe Scharrer, whose subjects are built things in the world as images, sometimes as, let's say, quote unquote, real buildings, continue to fascinate us as architectural constructs, whether they're by them or imagery of other architects, in the way they kind of frame, I think influence a lot of our discussions about what architecture could be like, what it could feel like. That's alternative to the way it's been practiced and visualized.
And do you think that looking to photography is a way to, I don't know, look for something that contemporary architecture is not producing? Like, because when I see your work, I can think of about a little amount of offices around the world that are working in this way, in this speculative and experimental, but absolutely real and concrete way. There's a lot of like formalist, soft architecture that is just a show off of technique. And I don't know, why do you, the question I believe is, why do you think that you're looking into photography or into other fields, into other disciplines, in order to, I don't know, get inspiration or get some kind of reference or some kind of model to work within? Do you think that the current panorama of architecture is like lacking something?
No, that's a tough question. It's a really good one though. I think for us, the photographers were the most interested in, again, these photographers coming out of Bernhard Hillebecker from the Dusseldorf School. There's a realism to the photography that you accept as somehow documenting things and or occurrences that exist in the world. And that once that's been accepted, you look at it a little longer. There's something wrong. There's something up with the image, with the photograph, with the context, the situation that's being presented. And that elongation of attention, that desire to look more closely, begins to reveal that there's a high level of artifice and abstraction and strangeness going on within the images. So instead of, let's say, moving all the way back to abstraction and then building up towards some kind of potential novelty, there's a desire within those photographers to take the real as if given and assumed and to disturb it, to alter it, to interfere with it, to infect it, to intervene in a manner that begins to allow the observers of those pieces to think about their world in a different manner. And I think architecture, when it's best, kind of does that. You were showing earlier an example of the wall relief detail, where we took Frey-Rieglet wall reveals, most common wall reveal detail in contemporary construction, and we began to fabricate our own, 3D print our own, that would do strange things to the wall. And again, with a lot of these projects, they're experiments where we have a kind of hunch of that detail is something that makes reality look abstract. Well, how can we take that and begin to push it further? And in some of the instances, that goes too far and it becomes kind of too much of a flourish. But when we're happiest with it, when it's best, it's when it operates in that kind of mode where there's a kind of subtle and or strange defamiliarization of the world around us. And we see that in photographers. Now, whether or not there's architects that do that, I think there are, and I think there has been. And I think a lot of our favorite architects have been able to do that over time. You know, there's, and again, we can get into names, but for instance, Luigi Moretti would be one to me who's constantly was able to, over his career, take certain assumptions about the ways in which either modernism at a certain moment or materiality or a relationship between a facade and its interior, or even like super disciplinary old school things about a base, an entry, a relationship to a pediment, how all of those things can be put into an altered set of relationships that would allow us to challenge our assumptions about how those things should relate to each other, should be understood with each other, should perform with each other. We could go many names, but first, also, I don't know if this is what you're asking too, Santiago, because it might just be straight like this kind of question. We had Peter Eisenman and Jesse Reiser as professors. Kutan and I worked for Jesse and Nanako at Reiser Umamoto. I was a teaching assistant to Peter Eisenman. It's interesting that the next two lectures are going to be that kind of triad, because these characters were hugely influential on us. And even though I don't think you could look at our work and say, oh yes, that is looks just like a Peter Eisenman project, I think that there's things that we learned from Peter about relationships to history, the importance of kind of rigor within a design process, and attention to representation as more than simply a representation of a project, but as a mode to produce arguments that's deep within us. And with Jesse and Nanako, the work that Reiser Umamoto did was hugely influential on us, both as students and as starting practitioners. And I think there's some projects that bear their influence in very direct ways.
It's great. I'm maybe going to do like kind of an hypothesis. I could be wrong, but looking at your work, preparation for this conversation, I find kind of transition. Of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but that maybe has to do, or I'm starting to think that has something to do with, I don't know, the technique or the instruments that you are using to produce this work. And I was thinking about the transition in time from linear and dense projects to projects that are more like volumetric and continuous. Like, I don't know, maybe in this project that is kind of, I believe this one is kind of a transition one between the gymnasium and what you're doing now. That is kind of a mixture, right? Like there is a volumetric approach to form, a synthetic approach form, continuous, and some kind of soft approach to form, to geometry. There is like translating ornament into a more like continuous volumetric figure. Do you feel like it's some kind of a transition, like what I'm saying, or some other? I'm thinking maybe in projects like, I'm going forward to show you, like the project that you published in Antagonismos. Not that I'm doing marketing here, but it's like a project that uses a lot of like collage into surfaces that are so very powerful volumetric, right? All the way to the DL1310 formats. Is there something like that, or I'm just imagining things?
I mean, I think that's spot on, and I think we're very comfortable with the shifting nature of the work. I think I want to say, like right prior to the Guggenheim competition, we kind of got maybe even annoyed with the kind of stuff we were doing. Like somehow there was an exhaustion of, I don't know, kind of overall gestures through which we were working when it came to the buildingness. And I think Guggenheim was a first attempt in trying to get to a whole, not through kind of aggregation of assembly parts, maybe like the lamp did, or kind of gesture towards it with a singular approach, but see if we could establish a middle scale of multiple characters to define the whole. Because within that, there are all kinds of potentials of symmetries, local asymmetries, potentials of kind of establishing multiple fronts and attitude towards various conditions. And it kind of got us a little bit out of that top-down understanding of what a building could be. And we began to break that down. I mean, you can trace some of the formal inclinations all the way to the early work, like the sukkah and stuff, in the way things are coupling together. But I think later the effect or the kind of quality that we were looking for is to deny ourselves a kind of singular reading of what a building stands for, and situate it in a place that didn't necessarily reside in kind of a gesture, nor total atomization of singular volume towards gradations and kind of expression of assembly of parts, but something that could open up maybe another way of understanding what part the whole relationship could be outside of what we typically know.
Yeah, just to add on to what Kutan was saying, you're absolutely right. There's changes and there's moments where things transition. When you're in the midst of it, you sometimes are doing it consciously because you're maybe tired of something you were doing. But there's also threads. Like if you look at this Guggenheim project, if you just go back just a couple slides to maybe, I don't know, one of these images, go back maybe one more. All right, so you see those patterns on there?
Yeah.
Right? Those are the drawings we were looking at earlier, literally put onto these objects and treated as ornaments and decoration. These are the colored drawings of the tangents and normals. That comes from an experiment we were doing with digital fabrication, where we're bringing those drawings as kind of mapped ZBrush and mudbox extrusions of textures onto objects to experiment with digital fabrication. The flower vases, in terms of the limbs and heads and kind of throttles and vessels, are here. They now look more like legs and sort of horns. The other kind of interest in a surface that goes from sharp as an edge to soft as a voluminous body, that is in the house in Sharjah. That's in the opera house in Busan. That's in every single project up until this point. But here, there is something different, and you're right to call it out. There's now these distinct elements that begin to become fused. And this will be used straight up in the Bauhaus. And maybe the most important things that happened in the Bauhaus was just that the edges and continuities begin to take on other architectural effects. One is the datum, that's the horizontal line that swipes through the entire project, that is the floor level, and kind of binds everything together, allows the building to float, produces a kind of harsh disjunction so that things can kind of hover below and above. The other is symmetry, which is all over the early drawings, but here now done in local moments. Every single thing in the project here is paired. It has a twin, sometimes right next to it, sometimes other places. The coloration comes from experiments with the drawings, but now is funneled through experiments with robotic tiling and studies of Bauhaus textile designs. So there's I don't know, it's funny to kind of put it all together in this manner, because sometimes you feel like you're making a radical change, not radical to architecture, but just radical to us. I mean, ultimately we're just talking about how Kutan and Michael talk about these projects. We think, man, yeah, we're really changing now. But then you all of a sudden realize, no, there's a thread that goes through this whole thing. And for what it's worth, slice one of these vessels here in the Bauhaus with a flat plane, you'll get the figure in the project for Kaunas in Lithuania.
Or you get the sukkah, right?
Or you get the sukkah. So you get a project that's 12 years old or a project that's a couple of years old. And so there's these distinct continuities between them. But maybe to the one thing we've built recently, the DL 1310 project in Mexico City, this is maybe a question now too, because we're starting to build, and what changes and what's continuous and what's discontinuous with certain lines of inquiry once you start to build. And that's an interesting question for us too. We see some continuities, but there are also things where we're starting to shift how we understand earlier desires and find other architectural manifestations for them. I don't know if I'm not trying to lead the conversation, Santiago. We can talk about whatever you wanted to talk to next. It seemed like we're maybe leading there, and so I kind of.
Yeah. No, it's okay, because we are almost we're getting to the hour of talking, so maybe we can open to questions from the audience. I would just like to ask one more that precisely has to do with this building, but maybe not precisely with this building, but this building maybe will complete the question, because the question is, how do you understand this, or how do you operate, or how do you capitalize in a creative way the process of the passage from drawing to materiality or construction? You work a lot with the digital fabrication, but obviously there are quite a lot more problems in a big building like this one relating this passage. So maybe you can elaborate on how do you experience this, the possibility to eventually going on and making these big models, because I believe that this building is like a big model of one of your object drawings, and you can see it both ways, right? So maybe you can elaborate on that process, or how do you experience this this transition from objects, big build or small buildings, and big buildings, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things to maybe call attention to in what you're asking. One is something we embraced from the get-go, is the understanding that we operate in a, multi-medium effort, that architecture is not just about drawing or digital modeling or building. We both are teachers, kind of relay and discuss and exchange architectural ideas in many different mediums through formats like this: writing, imaging, Instagram account, drawing, modeling, yes, building, but we never see this as a final act of producing architectural thinking. It is a phase through which we move. And in that, there are specific translations that happen. And I think one thing we embraced is, it is in those translations where you shift mediums, opportunities lie, and potential room for innovating something, not for the sake of novelty, but with a specific aesthetic agenda. And for us, I think this project was interesting in that sense, because it was going to operate outside of all technical limits of what we are used to in terms of our digital environments, within the very crude and low-tech construction technique of a mid-market level apartment building in Mexico City. There are no robots, there is no 3D printing, there is no computer, there is the layman with kind of traditional expertise in concrete building, and kind of our idealized version of what our architecture was going to look like. And it was kind of incredible in the sense how that translation began to offer kind of opportunities. Just to be specific, before I leave it to Michael, the translation of kind of the ruled surfaces within the windows, which is basically the only detail in the project, where the sill and header of a window that's rotated out of plane results in a ruled surface. How that was going to be constructed, seen here, how that going to be constructed was going to be basically everything about the project. You get that wrong, the project is, probably one of the worst things you can encounter. But that detail, where the window kind of goes in, results in these surfaces, is everything to a project that has certain limitations in terms of budget, construction technique, etc. So, you could get one unique formwork for those, for timber, to get all those markings. Then you blow through the budget, you break the concrete as you try to release them. So the kind of constraints that were pushed on the project kind of suggested that we translate that timber into another material, but preserve perhaps the woodiness of what we were looking for within the tradition of how we cast concrete buildings. So out of the formwork that was kind of built as a positive, we got negatives within fiberglass, but the fiberglass preserved the raised grains of the timber only for those instances to live in the project. So it's that kind of opportunity maybe that always we'll look for, where there's something that operates as a familiar technique, as a familiar, let's say, condition, a familiar convention, which we could subvert and turn on its head a little bit, like push on it to produce another kind of potential. And I think the entire pressure of the project and effort of the project went to this moment. And everything else is straight up, just typical construction, be it the unit plans, be it the other wall construction, etc. But it's that moment where we kind of recognize there is that potential, define everything, what this building has been able to do. And I kind of situate that in some kind of recognition of or exploitation of what can happen within a translation, whether it's within the material realm, whether it's in the digital realm, whether it's between conventions of what we take on as architects.
Yeah, cool. Well said, Kutan. Yeah, maybe just a couple things. If you want to link to the earliest work, all of those early drawings are basically transformations and translations of straight lines, ruled surfaces. So that geometry has been with us from the get-go. Things that are smooth and continuous and then break into discontinuity, that's been with us from the get-go, and it's here in these windows. But maybe a couple other things that we began to find almost is just that the window was more than just a strange device. It became all of a sudden a thing that from the outside, you could not tell if the building was very thick or very thin, meaning that it was disciplinarily questioning poche. It also at different times of day would look, because of the darkness of the windows, almost like a ruin. And then at night, the reflectivity and the kind of luminosity coming from within made it look more like a crystal, more technological, more refined in a way. So it was hovering somehow between something that was, I don't know, like old and carved, and then at the same time beginning to become more technological or more refined. That detail also allowed the surface to kind of hover between something that was very blocky, very rectangular, and yet up close when you got to it, very sort of soft. Bas relief, kind of fluctuated in its depth, in a low relief, again, like the sensations of the drawing. And then when you went inside, the windows did super weird things to your views out to the environment, because it meant that you were looking two directions simultaneously. You were looking through one window, in oblique in another window, and that meant that you were looking through two facades, yet by pulling into the same space and being as large as they are, that began to look, it's like pulling your eyeballs two directions at the same time. And that kind of charged the interior to have these pockets of where you would want to sit, where you wouldn't want to sit, where you would use this space differently, where you'd do something else over here. And then just strange moments of being inside, looking outside to the inside that's looking to another outside. Some of that was investigated and desired and experimented with and predicted. Other things occurred that's kind of surprised us, and we're just super excited about that. And it's kind of amazing when it happens, and it happens quite often. So in a way, there's themes that are continuing to be investigated, but they get changed and they get shifted and they get translated when scale alters, when material alters, when all these other factors that have to do with architecture come to play and influence the process.
I mean, I think one last thing to add, I think this is, it took like 5 years to do this project. So if you kind of trace it back, it also is following, like Guggenheim and Bauhaus. So right there, it's already kind of a shift for us right after those couple of projects, maybe into a territory where kind of maybe situate questions of complexity, not within the formal, but within aesthetic understanding of how something can resonate with one's perception. And I think this project for us is kind of more, you know, towards that work in that way. So now we've always dealt with simple forms, even like the kind of project in Sharjah or the hotel in Turkey in the early days. Like we never claimed, I guess, a position in terms of, you know, like one type of form or another. I think it becomes more project specific, and it's guided by, I guess, particular aesthetic ambitions that a project can carry with. Because to claim a position within a specific norm of what architecture should be like seems very uninteresting to us. And also as teachers who engage new generations year after year, to remain fresh and interested in topics that comes in front of us by different constituencies that have other desires towards life. I think it allows us to kind of remain fresh ourselves towards others, but also towards the work that we do.
That's great, guys. I got a lot of questions, but I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, and I'm going to open to questions from the audience, if it's all right with you, so we can do this like more interactive. So here we have a question. I don't know if you can read it, but I'm going to read it anyway, so everyone can hear it. Maximiliano says, hi, great work. I found very interesting how you face the context in your work. In your article, That Life, you affirmed that contextualism is the greatest lie that architects tell themselves. I agree, and I wonder if you could explain this a little bit more and how the idea of estrangement and the familiarization could operate in a projective way. What a question.
All right. Thank you for the question. Yeah, the context is incredibly important for architects. I don't think you can do architecture without some stance on your relationship to your context, but we quite often use it, architects in general, all of us, as alibis for other things and other decisions. And that's what I mean by the greatest lie. It's this way in which we kind of convince others that our new intervention that will happen in the future is somehow integral and bounded and related in almost a natural way to the things that have come, be they historical or cultural or ecological even, prior to it. So our stance on context, which has evolved too and has changed over the past 12 years, often situates itself in a relationship that, we'll use these words again, estrangement or defamiliarization. But when we talk about it kind of to ourselves and to the projects we're working on, is how can you introduce a building, a thing, into a situation in which it allows and or encourages others to experience that situation that preceded it in ways other than they assumed that context to be. Meaning it could come into your neighborhood that you've been walking by the same buildings every day for the past 40 years. And all of a sudden, because of one intervention, again, it can be in many different scales, but we'll just say, let's say this, the scale of a building, that building allows you to see your neighborhood, your environment, your context, your daily background in other ways, alternate manners. Not about novelty or the negation of that context, nor is it about fitting in and somehow creating a fake representation of that context and all of its sort of materially embedded histories. It's about actually coming in and taking that context seriously as a construction in all forms of construction and involving itself and involving us, you, in ways in which we can begin to understand our world to be other than we assume it to be. There's much more to say on this, but I think it's something that we're becoming more and more convinced on, that it's really in the aesthetics of the background where quite a bit of real experimentation and chances can be taken. And that can still be very strange. This is not about somehow an assumption of normality. That is fundamentally in question. I don't know, we can say more, maybe, I don't know if that's enough. Maybe Kutan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one willful effort, both in our teaching and our projects lately, has been to really not produce imagery in relationship to context that verifies how a building is projected, but really kind of imagine maybe future past understanding of how it could be situated in the world, meaning that what happens if you look back to the project rather than look forward to the project. What changes around it? What changes on it? How does it get domesticated? How does it get consumed? How does it get kind of pushed into a situation where it is the context, it's with the context, it's of the context, and none of which has to do in the way we kind of maybe use context as an alibi to verify a cultural project, right? The hope would be that it alters culture. It doesn't verify culture. That's, if you can do that as architects, that's where we have power. The moment we work in, trying to validate, verify conditions that define our environment, I think we're coming from behind.
What in that way that you're talking, Kutan, what do you feel or think that the perfect context would be to work with? But can you imagine a perfect context to work with?
Never thought about this. I don't think. Like I would assume like any context suggests its own potentials to kind of examine, but not in the sense that, oh, like this looks like this, let's make it like this. It's not one towards affinity, I guess. It's necessarily for us, it's not necessarily towards insertion of novelty for the sake of difference, but maybe identifying tensions that lie in existing context that begins to operate with conditions that are there, but not towards mimicking them, but towards really kind of defining other criteria for them with the work. So I don't know, like if I think Michael would agree, if we were to say, oh, this is the ideal place to do a project, I think we would be kind of feeding our own purpose of trying to change and evolve.
And I think part of engaging in challenging notions of context is that you don't control it all. You can't actually, I mean, part of what makes things end up having interest to push back on and to push you into new forms of thinking and new forms of expression is that you can't completely predict it, control it, idealize it, exhaust it. There's always something else. There's always something in it and to it that you hadn't seen before, that you couldn't imagine before. And I think that's something important about context.
All right, we have another question here in the chat. I'm going to read it out loud. What could be said to be your relationship with philosophy? I have heard Michael talking about object-oriented ontology or speculative realism. but at the same time, I can't help but relate you more to the Delusion project. How do you think you approach the intersection between various philosophical systems that are sure to influence you?
Without a doubt, we've been influenced by Graham Harman and object-oriented ontology, and we've been influenced by Deleuze. I mean, Deleuze was especially, you know, we're of a certain age where we went to undergraduate school in the early 90s, and then spent a period of time in offices, and then went to graduate school in the early 2000s. And within that kind of span of conversations, Deleuze was fundamental, just like crucial. And I think especially for us, the work on Francis Bacon, the work on the logic of sensation was a kind of fundamental book in our graduate studies. And as far as what Graham has been arguing and offering, I think it is some of the most interesting philosophical writing in the past 15 years. And we've been talking with, we know Graham, we've been speaking with him for now almost close to a decade. I guess I don't see them as antithetical. I know that some people have made those arguments that somehow Deleuze and Triple O are against each other and Triple O has replaced Deleuze. I don't see that. I also don't see either of them as being potentially directly applicable or manifested in architecture. I don't see them as formal agendas for things. For me, I'm still interested in some questions that Deleuze raised about aesthetics, about sensation, about perception, and about intensity and variation. Still interested in them. And I'm very interested in Graham's arguments about aesthetics as first philosophy and notions of realism as a relationship to the world that cannot be explained away by either watering something down or over-determining it within one's subjectivity. Now, what does that look like as architecture? I have no idea. I really do not. And all I know is that it has challenged us to look at the things we make, the representations we make, the aesthetics that our buildings produce in the world in alternate manners. So I guess to answer your question, which I think is an important question, and it's a great question, we are interested in philosophy because we're interested in culture and interested in ideas. We are not interested in it as an alibi for the architecture that we make. And so I guess this is just a way, I think it's nice sometimes to have a really candid conversation about one's relationship to other cultural discourses. But I don't think either of us would ever kind of sit down and say, our architecture looks like this because it's a manifestation of this philosopher's argument, and thus it has value for that. I know that's not what the question is asking, but I think it's important to be clear about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree. I think we've always been interested in the thing in and of itself, just this architectural thing. I think Harman's writing in some way articulated that in a profound manner in a larger philosophical discourse. And we like reading it because it kind of allows us to kind of clarify how we think about our projects. Not that, you know, we kind of use it as a recipe book. I think architecture has done that mistake quite a few times. That seems to be kind of a dead end, or at least kind of experimental route. But you know, in the way Harman talks about the world, there is just a different understanding of how a value structure could be established. And that's different than anything else out there. And just for that reason, it's worth exploring. You know, do we engage it directly? I would say no. Are we super interested? Yes. Are we close to the other ideas? Absolutely no. I think in some way, kind of any kind of field that begins to challenge your assumptions about the world, be it philosophy, be it geography, be it photography, be it any other field that comes in from the left field and suggests other ways of seeing the world, experiencing the world, thinking about the world. I think we think more the better.
It's great. Okay. If there's anyone else who wants to formulate a question, you can click the hand icon, and we can also open your microphone. You can speak directly if you like, or you can express the question in Spanish also, and I can try to translate. And if not, we're okay. So you have been so generous. Really, thank you very much for all this talking. I would like to continue talking, but I know we're like an hour and a half. So it would be nice if we can have maybe one more question. If not, we can call it a day. Okay, so thank you very much, Michael Kutan. Have the opportunity to talk live to you was great. We exchanged emails in the past, and I was very familiar with the work, but it's amazing to talk with you guys. So thank you very much for taking the time and doing this.
Yeah, Santiago, thanks for having us, and it's also great to meet you. And what you're doing, we think is fantastic. So with the publications, with the conversations, with the involvement in discourse, keep it up. And whenever you want us to be participant in whichever way, we're in full support. And we'd love to come to Argentina. We have all these Argentinian friends in New York and Los Angeles, and we've never been to Argentina. So we have to come. We have to resolve somehow, like the Buenos Aires Rosario situation that people tell us about. But we're, I'm from California, live in New York. Kutan's from Istanbul, and we just are interested. We have questions, so we're coming to Argentina sometime. Look out, and excited. Have some barbecue.
Yeah, for sure.
We're gonna work that out for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Santiago. Thanks for the invitation. Also it was, I don't know if you got the same feeling, Michael, kind of, it's been a while not looking everything all at once. We do that periodically for, dossiers and stuff, but maybe sitting together looking and kind of talking about it. It's always kind of healthy, for a partnership. And one question kind of snuck in as Michael was talking about. What's the advice for young architects to get new projects? I'm gonna answer it and tweak that. We're probably the wrong people to ask how to get new projects. Like in some way we dug our heels in terms of what is it how we want to practice, and if and when that brings commissions, we are happy to do it. That sounds kind of a luxury, but I think that goes to saying we privileged our kind of teaching careers so that we can actually have that space to speculate and explore. But the one advice I think we both would give you is when you start practicing, get a pal, get a buddy, get a partner. And don't practice in the vacuum of your own mind where you will verify everything without conversation, without exchange, without somebody else challenging what you think, without somebody else maybe telling you there's another angle. And I think that's something we kind of developed in our practice, that there's always another angle that one doesn't see. And if two people kind of working across from one another can, through conversation, really forge another path at all times. That's a path that you don't know as a solo person. So the advice is to don't do it alone.
That's great. And with that message, we can wrap up. So thank you very much, both of you, and the people who joined, and hope we can see each other soon. And the best. Thank you very much for your generosity. We're going to be talking.
Absolutely.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.
So, the best.
Thanks for having us.
All right.
See you soon.
Thanks, Santiago. Bye.